On October 25, 1983, U.S. Marines landed on the Caribbean island of Grenada and quickly toppled its Marxist government. What was the U.S. doing invading this tiny island nation? And how did this event become one of the most controversial military operations of the Cold War? Grenada is a small Caribbean island nation south of the larger Caribbean island of Trinidad. Throughout the 1970s, the Grenadian people grew increasingly frustrated with their government's inability to address their economic concerns. On March 6, 1979, new National Party leader Maurice Bishop led a military coup that overthrew the established government, and Grenada became the newest Marxist state in the Western Hemisphere. As a result of the coup, several right-wing Grenadians fled to neighboring Trinidad and formed an anti-communist exile government. Meanwhile, Bishop aligned Grenada with the Soviet Union and Cuba, much to the dismay of the United States. However, Bishop's popularity quickly waned as his regime grew increasingly brutal. In October 1983, thousands of Grenadians protested against the government when Bishop responded by deploying troops to shoot at the crowds, killing several. The United States had little interest in the internal affairs of Grenada, but the situation rapidly became a major concern when it was discovered that approximately 1,000 American citizens were still living on the island, many of whom were attending St. George's University, a private medical school. The U.S. became worried about their safety after Bishop's government seized 2 radio stations and shut down the island's television. On October 22, the U.S. sent a team of special operators to the island to determine the best course of action. Their mission was called Operation Bootstrap, and the operators landed in Grenada undetected. They assessed the situation and concluded that American citizens would be safest if the U.S. military overthrew Bishop's government and installed the Grenadian exile government in its place. But before any of this could happen, tragedy struck. During the early morning hours of October 25th, one of the helicopters carrying special operators to the airfield for their exfil again was shot down. All 5 men aboard were killed, including 2 Navy SEALs. This attack not only jeopardized the entire operation, but also forced the Americans to respond immediately to the deaths of their comrades. At 4:06 a.m. on October 25, 1983, 2 battalions of Marines, 1 battalion of soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division, and several hundred special operators from the Army's Special Forces landed on Grenada's beaches. Just hours later, they had secured the airport, which allowed additional American forces to land. By the end of the day, over 7,000 American troops were on the island. Meanwhile, elements of the Grenadian People's Revolutionary Army attempted to mount resistance, but were quickly overwhelmed by the superior firepower of the Americans. The U.S. troops faced little opposition from the Grenadian army, which was essentially comprised of conscripts who didn't even have access to weapons. By the end of the first day, American troops had complete control of the island's infrastructure, including its government buildings, radio stations, and airports. Over the next few days, they searched house to house for members of the Grenadian military and supporters of Bishop's government. Anyone who refused to leave their home when ordered by American soldiers was arrested and sent to a makeshift prison camp. In total, 222 members of the Grenadian military and 188 political prisoners were captured by the Americans. However, this was without controversy, as many of those detained were actually civilians who had no affiliation with Bishop's government. Nevertheless, these people were held without charge or trial until the Americans left Grenada in November. Meanwhile, Bishop's government collapsed after his close friend and defense minister Bernard Cord led a coup against him. The Americans didn't support or oppose this move, but simply allowed it to happen while they consolidated their control over the island. Eventually, Card was forced to flee Grenada, and he and Bishop both went into exile in Cuba. After the American invasion, the U.S. installed the Grenadian exile government and began working to restore order to the country. The American military remained in control of Grenada throughout this process, which further inflamed anti-American sentiment on the island. On October 31, 1983, the U.S. announced that they were sending 6,000 more troops to Grenada, bringing the total number of American troops there to over 13,000. This caused outrage among many countries around the world, especially in Latin America, where many believed the U.S. was repeating the mistakes of the early 1960s by intervening in a sovereign nation. The Organization of Eastern Caribbean States demanded the immediate withdrawal of American troops from Grenada, while other countries, like Venezuela and Jamaica, expressed their opposition to the intervention. This reaction caught the Reagan administration off guard, and they quickly began working to justify their actions in Grenada. The administration argued that the presence of American citizens on the island justified their intervention since the Grenadian government couldn't protect them. But critics argued that the U.S. had a responsibility to protect their citizens abroad, not necessarily through military intervention, but through diplomatic means. However, the biggest argument in favor of the Grenadian intervention was the presence of a Marxist government on a small island just 100 miles off the coast of Venezuela. This intervention was partly a product of the Cuban Revolution and the subsequent expansion of communism throughout the Western Hemisphere. Following Fidel Castro's rise to power in 1959, several left-wing groups in Latin America sought to emulate this revolution and overthrow their own governments. However, this proved to be extremely difficult because of the strong ties between these governments and the United States. So instead, these groups focused on smaller Caribbean islands where they could more easily seize power. By the 1970s, several of these Marxist governments had been established in the Caribbean, including in Grenada, Dominica, Guyana, and Jamaica. As a result, the U.S. feared that these governments were creating a communist domino effect in the region. Therefore, they actively worked to prevent the spread of Marxism throughout the Caribbean by supporting anti-communist movements and even overthrowing certain governments, like in Grenada. In fact, this intervention was seen as a way to restore democracy to Grenada, which according to the Reagan administration was being suppressed by Bishop's government. But this claim was also somewhat misleading, because the Grenadian government was elected through democratic processes. Many people on the island supported Bishop and his socialist agenda, which included universal healthcare, free education, and nationalization of the means of production. However, his government grew increasingly unpopular after they failed to improve the economy and lift the Grenadian people out of poverty. This led to protests and violence on the streets of Grenada, which ultimately resulted in the death of several citizens and the American invasion. Critics argue that the U.S. wasn't interested in restoring democracy to Grenada, but rather simply removing a Marxist government from power. If that was the case, why didn't the U.S. install a democratically elected government? Instead, the U.S. chose to install a right-wing exile government that was handpicked by American officials. Nevertheless, the Grenadian intervention was a highly controversial operation that showcased the growing tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The presence of Cuban and Soviet officials on the island prior to the American invasion demonstrates that Grenada had become a new battleground in this global conflict. But this event also highlights the limitations of American power during the latter half of the 20th century. Despite having a large and powerful military, the US was unable to prevent the spread of communism throughout the Caribbean. In fact, their intervention in Grenada was more of a symbolic gesture than anything else, since it didn't really alter the global balance of power. In the end, the US restored a right-wing government to power in Grenada, but this didn't solve any of the island's deep-rooted problems. In fact, many Grenadians resented the Americans for their involvement in their country's affairs, and this led to ongoing anti-American sentiment on the island. It took many years for the Grenadian people to forgive the Americans for their intervention, but eventually this event became a turning point in their history. Today, Grenada has become a popular tourist destination known for its beautiful beaches and lush tropical forests. Many people visit the island each year to pay tribute to the Grenadian people who lost their lives during the American intervention. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Grenadian invasion. If you want to learn more about the Cold War, check out my video on the Bay of Pigs invasion. Thanks for watching.